it's Craig here from fixitfallows. Today we're in the kitchen. We are actually standing in what is an extension to the house. So from the camera to me is extension, from beyond the camera back is existing part of the house. The issue we're having here is with the ceiling. The joists in the old part of the house are about ½ an inch lower than the joists for the new part. And as a consequence, the plaster boards on each part of those parts of the house are at different heights. So where they meet, the one set of boards are having to be bent upwards to meet the newer joists. And along that join is a constant sort of pressure for the boards to want to pull back down, and it's causing a crack. Now, the ceiling and this extension has been up now for about 10 years, so I'm kind of thinking that most movement has taken place. I'm hoping that those plaster boards are as stressed and have assumed a sort of resting state now. So after 10 years, I kind of figured it's time to sort the crack out. So let's get into it. So here's the ceiling in question. The ceiling over here is the existing house. The ceiling here is the new extension. And as we go up and get closer to it, you can see again on the wall, the step in the wall, old house to the left, new house to the right. And across here you can see the crack. There we are. It runs directly across the ceiling over to the far side. And that kind of correlates directly where the first new roof joist is in this kitchen. So looking at the crack, this is old roof, if you like. This is new roof. This part of the ceiling is wanting to pull downwards and causing this crack. Okay, so this is what we're going to do with this crack. Here we are. I mean, it's a fairly substantial crack, but I mean, certainly there are bigger. I mean, it's not even really a millimetre wide. Now, what would be commonplace to be done here would be to get some filler and apply it over the crack like that. So obviously I'm just illustrating here and hoping that a sufficient amount of the filler squeezes into this crack and then adheres to the edges of the crack sufficient enough that any movements, bumps and crashes that might go on the floor above don't cause it to fall back out. So what I like to do with these cracks like this is first of all to make them bigger. It sounds a bit counterintuitive, but there is method to my madness. So what I do is I take a Stanley knife and I will scrape out along here on both sides to make a deeper channel for any material that I use as a filler to get into. So there's more body to the filler. The next important stage is ensuring that that filler actually adheres. And again, by opening up the crack, you can hoover out the joints, and then you can use PVA or Bonder to wash over the joints to seal off any debris inside the crack. Now, plasterboard is naturally a very chalky, dusty material, and things don't like sticking to it. So using PVA will seal it off. Once it's sealed, you can then fill the crack and be more confident that the material that you're using as a filler will adhere to the plasterboard. So here we are up at the crack. I'm now going to take a Stanley knife blade and I'm going to rake out the joint. So just take one side first of all, and then the other side, like so. Make it nice and deep, taking away any loose material that you can already see that was loose there. Now, when you're doing this, you obviously want to put a nice dust sheet on the floor. You can always hold your hoover up as you're doing it to catch all the bits, like so. Alternatively, hold the dustpan underneath and do it at the same time. You can use a Stanley knife, or you can use a nice sharp chisel. But that's the sort of look you're trying to achieve. So we'll do that all the way along the ceiling and then move on to the next stage. Okay, so I've raked out the joint all the way to the far end of where the crack had formed. I cannot see any more visible signs of the crack in this last remaining part of the ceiling. I did go a little bit further than the visible signs, so I've gone to there. Now, what I like to do here is that cracks like to have a focus point, and the focus point is the start of the crack, the very finest point. So what I do in this instance is at the end, I drill a round hole like this. And what this does, it gets rid of the focal point for the crack. Now the energy that's travelling through the crack will get dispersed around a greater area, so there's no actual direct focal point. This will, in many instances, help slow down the growth of any further crack. This hole here, by the way, is one of the drywall screws that went into the ceiling, and the plaster has just popped off because it didn't adhere to the screw head properly. So whilst doing the crack, I've just raked out the loose plaster, PVA over that to seal off the dust, apply a little bit of filler or plaster over the top, and that just should sort that situation out.
And now I'll just sand off any rough edges on the enlarged crack and any flaking paint or plaster. And now for a hoover of all the crack, get all the remaining dust and debris out of it.
Now we need to make up a little bit of PVA mixture so that we can brush it into that crack and seal the crack off. Remember, when plasterboard is sawn, the sawn edge is really quite chalky and almost soft. So the PVA, which is just the glue at the end of the day, in fact this stuff, PVA, is what is effectively the glue that your children may have used in arts and crafts at school. It's the basis for a lot of wood glue. It just comes in different concentrations. I like to keep a tub of this stuff, like this is like a 5 litre tub. It's really not that expensive. Keep it in the garage, it comes in handy for all sorts of things. So there we go, we just take the lid off, pour a little bit in, don't need that much, and then we'll dilute it down with some water. Now there are always instructions on the back here of what mixture you need for different applications. I'll leave that to you to read. I like to do it by eye, and I'll bring you in closer to see how I do it. So there we are, I've got the PVA in the bottom of the bowl there, and I'm just going to pour a splash of water in, mix it around. We want it really to absorb into the sawn edge of the plasterboard a bit, so it needs to be a little bit on the runny side, but not too runny that it's not effective. I mean, it's a hard one to call, but you can't really go too wrong. There we go, that should do it. That will be sufficient for dampening down all of the dust and creating a solid enough surface for the filler or plaster to adhere to. Okay, so here we are back up at the ceiling. We're going to take the brush and the PVA mixture, and we're going to stipple it into the areas that I've raked out, pushing it in as far as possible. We want to seal all those loose dusty bits down to give a nice surface for our plaster or filler to adhere to. It will drip a little bit, just have a rag to hand to wipe away any excess, And there we are, we're just brushing it and stippling it into that joint, making sure we get everything nice and covered, like so. Okay, now that you've applied your PVA, just take a damp, wet, clean cloth and just wipe off the excess off of the surface. And any drips that may have gone down other places. And then we'll just leave that to dry. So whilst doing this crack, I obviously scanned the rest of the ceiling, and I did come across this one screw head that had started just to pop free. So using a Stanley knife, I flicked out the loose bit of plaster. I've given it a very light sand with a bit of paper. I've given it a hoover, and now I just need to PVA it so I can then fill it over. Okay, so I need to PVA that one screw head that we just saw. Now I don't have any more mixture left from what I've done yesterday, and I don't really want to make up a big batch, so it's always handy to have a roll of kitchen foil available when you're ever doing any work around the house. Take off a small bit of kitchen foil, fold it over like so. Turn it over, bends the sides up. Like that. Pinch the corners together, pulling the sides back up. And there you go, you've made yourself a small little tray for mixing stuff in. You can make these in any size. Obviously I've made a very small one here. I often do this when I'm drilling holes in walls. I make a bigger tray and I take the tray like this, put some masking tape along the back edge, tape this to the wall underneath where I'm drilling, and then any drill dust falls in there. You can then just capture your dust, screw this up and throw it in the bin. Nice and easy. So anyway, let's just mix up a little bit of PVA for that one screw head. I really don't need much. I'm just going to tip the PVA forward, dip the brush in like so, put it in the tray, dip my brush back into the water and just dilute that PVA down a bit. There we go. Now I've got enough for doing that one screw head, and when I'm finished I can just screw this up and put it in the bin. Okay, so I shall actually be using plaster to fill the crack in my ceiling. Now I do have a bag of plaster that I keep sealed up down the shed for any such work like this. I find it a much more economical way of doing things. Now bearing in mind this bag of Thistle multi-finish 25 kilo bag was about £7 from B&Q. This will last for a long time doing filling jobs like this, I can assure you. Well, you bear in mind if you buy a tub of polyfiller or Ronseal or something like that from your local hardware store, you know, a 500-600 gram tub will probably be £7 or £8. Doesn't last very long either. Once those fillers tubs are opened, they start going off. So you do a job, use it, put it back on the shelf, go back to it 6-7 months later, a year later, and the stuff's no good anymore and you've barely used any of it. Now the packaging on this Thistle multi-finish says that it has got a shelf life, but you're not looking to use it for like fine plastering of an entire ceiling or entire wall. You're just looking to do a few little touch-ups. Now in my experience I've found that if you once you've opened this bag, you start using it, if you twist the paper bag shut, then put it inside a plastic bag like a rubble sack like that, and then tie a knot in that. That will keep for a long time, good enough for the sort of work that we're doing with this. Okay, now to mix some plaster up. Now we don't need much because that's not a particularly big job we're doing there. So I'm just going to knock some plaster into a mixing bowl. Like so. I like to use credit cards, one for mixing and two for applying filler
or other materials for filling. This one's a Shell Club card. You can pick these up at your petrol station. Old membership cards, they're really good. They're flexible, they're just about the right size, and you can be very adaptive of the way you apply. So got the powder in there, and then we start mixing the water in a bit at a time. There we are. Now I've actually put too much water in there, so we're going to add a bit more powder. Now obviously if you was doing proper plastering of an entire room, entire wall, you would mix up a lot differently. You would put it in a big bucket. You would have a power mixer, which is basically a large drill with a paddle on the end of it that stirs the mixture up. But for this job, it'd be quite sufficient to do it by hand. There we are. You keep working it. You want to get rid of any lumps and bumps. Now, bearing in mind we're using this as a filler, we don't want it to be as thin as you might normally use it for skimming a wall. We want it to have a bit of body to it and a bit of tackiness, so that we can press it into that now deeper groove that we've made, and it will fill that and pack in and get a nice bit of adhesion. So that should do it. In fact, I'm thinking that will be way more than I actually need for that crack, but not so much that it's really wasteful. Okay, so here we are for the crack, and I'm going to take some of the filler and I'm going to squeeze it into that crack. Now what we're looking to do at this stage is just to fill it up. We're not looking for a perfect surface, so we can scrape away any excess. What we want to do is pressure that into the joint to get it to adhere. And pushing nice and hard in there, we'll do the whole crack like that, and then leave it to go off for a little while, and then we can put a second coat over the top, where we'll be looking to get a more even flush finish with the surface. So initially, let's just get that crack filled up. Okay, having pushed that into the crack, it hasn't gone off dry yet, but we're just going to wipe away some of the excess from here. Doesn't matter if you take a little bit out of the crack itself. As I say, at the moment we're just looking to fill the depths, not looking for a perfect finish. There we go. Okay, so now the crack and the plaster has been wiped down, and we shall wait for that to go off. Probably best to give it about 40 minutes or so before applying the top coat. So whilst we're just waiting for that first application of plaster to go off, I've cleaned out the bowl of the excess, and there is the excess plaster. You can see I made up too much. This stuff does go a long way. There's no point in using that, but I'm going to leave that there because that will be an indication to us of how quickly the plaster's going off. Okay, so it's finally gone off. Not fully, but you know, look, it's a solid lump. Big lumps like that take longer to go off than thin skims on walls or whatnot. Also, you need to take into account that I'm in the garage here, there's no heating, and it's only, what's that, 12, 14 degrees, so that will slow down the cure rate a lot. So here we are with the second batch of plaster. I've made this batch a bit runnier, if you want to call it that, you see. Softer consistency, smoother, and we're going to put that up on the ceiling. Okay, So back with the credit card, we are going to apply plaster over, like so. We're going to leave a little bit more residue this time, because what we want it to do is start to go off, and then we can use a small trowel to smooth it right off, level with the painted surface of the ceiling. There will be a combination of trowel, spraying it with a fine mist of water, and then using the plastering trowel on it, and then we should get a relatively good flush fix to our crack, and one that hopefully lasts a while. Worst case scenario, if you can't trail it off all that well, you can always take a very fine sandpaper to it and sand it off. This whole ceiling's got to be repainted anyway, so there's no drama. But we're just trying to save as much elbow grease as possible. There we go, so making sure we're floating over the top of that crack. We're going to take a fine mist water bottle sprayer like this and just wet that plaster, and then using a trowel we're going to apply pressure and pull it back, like so. And you see that takes off a layer of plaster. We'll do that all the way along, then we'll spray it again and do the same again. Okay, having sprayed it with your fine mist spray and run the trowel over it, you should end up with something pretty much like this. Admittedly, I've done that twice, and then I've gone along with a damp rag and wiped the excess off to the side of the joint, taking great care not to actually wipe the joint itself, because at the moment that plaster is still soft enough that a rag would dig into it. So now what we need to do is just let it go off to the point where we can run a damp cloth over it, and it will take that excess plaster off of the white paint of the ceiling, and then we'll spray it with the fine mist again and give it another bit of a working with the trowel, and after that it should be pretty much good to go. A couple of layers of paint over it and then paint the whole ceiling, and you really won't notice that unless you scrutinise it at close detail. Worst case scenario is once it's fully dry, you just have to go over it with a very fine sandpaper, just really lightly, just to take any high points off. But I think you'll be quite pleased with the results.
Okay, now that it's dry, let's give it a wash down with a wet sponge. Okay, it does just need a little bit of a sand.
Okay, so now it's all finished. There is no discernible feel there at all between the existing ceiling and the new filled crack. That is as smooth as it could be. Once this ceiling is over painted, there will be no visible crack there whatsoever. Okay, so now I've just put a mist coat of paint over the crack, over the plaster, to seal it off. Hopefully some of the paint will absorb in. So mist coat is a very watered down emulsion. That should get drawn into the new plaster and seal it off, so that new coats of paint will adhere to it nicely.
And now you can see the ceiling fully finished. It's had a complete repaint. As you can see by the end wall, the kitchen has been fully decorated with new wallpaper. In fact, this video is of the ceiling as it is now in April. The work to repair the crack I filmed back in January, so this repair has now been done for over 3 months and there is no visible sign of that crack returning.